A little after night prayers had begun in Jarafa, a village outside Omdurman. Automatic gunfire tore into a mosque filled with worshippers. By the time police units reached the area, people were already being carried toward hospitals, and the first reports spoke of 20 dead. Officers surrounded the mosque. An armed man exchanged fire with them and refused to surrender. One policeman was wounded before the gunman was shot dead. That should have made the basic outline simple. One attacker, one weapon, one scene. But it didn't. Two people quoted in the earliest reporting, including a police officer, said they had seen several attackers. One described men in dark clothing. Other witnesses believed the shots had come from more than one direction. Yet the official police account named a single gunman and said the investigation indicated that he had acted alone. Then another question emerged. The mosque had been targeted before, and according to members of the congregation, threats had been made before this attack as well. So who was the man police killed outside the mosque? Why did he have a history with the people praying inside? And if warnings had already been reported, why was he free to return armed? This is the story of Abbas al-Baqir Abbas and the Jarafa Mosque Massacre. Let's begin. Jarafa, also written in contemporary reports as Jarafa or Al-Jarafa, lies north of Omdurman, across the Nile from Sudan's capital, Khartoum. In December 2000, one of the mosques serving the area belonged to Ansar al-Sunnah al-Mohammediyah, a Sunni religious movement with a long-established presence in Sudan. For the people who attended that mosque, the evening of December 8th fell during Ramadan. Worshippers gathered not for a political meeting or an armed confrontation, but for prayer. Sudanese reporting described them as attending the evening and Ramadan prayers. Men and women were in their respective sections of the mosque. The people killed that night were members of a congregation whose individual lives were barely documented in the international coverage that followed. Most reports reduced them to numbers almost immediately. 20 dead, dozens wounded. But the mosque itself already carried a history that mattered to the people who used it. Violent disputes involving extremist factions had struck Ansar al-Sunnah communities during the 1990s. In February 1994, gunmen attacked an Ansar al-Sunnah mosque in Omdurman. Contemporary and later sources disagree on the exact number killed, but the attack left many worshippers dead and others wounded. The principal attacker, Muhammad Abdullah al-Khalifi, was captured, convicted, and executed later that year. There was also violence closer to Jarafa itself. BBC reporting from December 2000 noted that the same mosque had been attacked in 1996 and that 12 people were killed. Other Sudanese accounts grouped the Jarafa violence with attacks in places including Al Dawaim and Wad Madani. The precise chronology varies by source, but the larger point is well supported. The people praying in Jarafa on December 8th belonged to a movement that had repeatedly been targeted. The distinction between these movements is important here. Ansar al-Sunnah was a conservative Sunni movement, while contemporary police descriptions portrayed the Takfir wal Hijra current as a group that regarded contemporary Muslim society as unbelieving and accepted coercion in returning people to what it considered true Islam. Those were the authorities' descriptions of the movements, not a theological judgment this story needs to make. What matters is that this ideological conflict had already produced violence. Other incidents followed. Reporting from the period described clashes and attacks involving people identified with Takfir wal Hijra, a small extremist current whose adherents accused other Muslims of abandoning true Islam. There were violent incidents in the middle and late 1990s, including another attack associated with an Ansar al-Sunnah mosque and a 1997 knife attack that killed worshippers. The labels require some care. Takfir wal Hijra had roots outside Sudan, most famously in Egypt, but Sudanese Interior Ministry officials said after the Jarafa massacre that the Sudanese group was not organizationally connected to the Egyptian parent movement or to the so-called Afghan Arabs. The local label, therefore, should not be taken as proof of direction from a larger international organization. At around 9 that evening, while the congregation was praying, a man armed with an automatic rifle approached the Ansar al-Sunnah Mosque. Accounts from police and major news organizations say the gunman fired through a window into the worshippers. The first burst of reporting was confused, which is common in the immediate aftermath of a mass shooting. Sudanese state television initially reported 20 people killed and around 40 wounded. An early Al-Bayan report said the attacker had been arrested. That detail did not survive the next day's official account. The firing continued as people tried to escape. Some later reports said the women's section was not deliberately targeted, but the most securely established fact is that the attack concentrated on the praying congregation and caused mass casualties within minutes. Then police arrived. Police spokesman Major General Uthman Yaqub said officers surrounded the area. According to his statement, the attacker exchanged fire with police and wounded an officer. He refused to surrender, and police shot him dead. Other reporting said 4 police units had responded. Witnesses told Al-Bayan that the gunman had a large amount of ammunition and continued resisting the patrol until he moved close enough to a military position for security personnel to shoot him. The man killed in that exchange was identified as Abbas al-Baqir Abbas. Once police identified Abbas as the dead gunman, his background and his relationship with the congregation became central to the investigation. By 2000, Abbas al-Baqir Abbas was 33 years old. Contemporary Sudanese reporting placed his origins in a village in Jazeera State, south of Khartoum. An Interior Ministry briefing reported that he had attended Al-Nilain University without completing his studies and had also spent time working in Libya. Abbas had also served in Sudan's Popular Defense Forces, a paramilitary force that supported the army during the country's civil war. According to an Interior Ministry briefing, he had taken part in fighting in the south, particularly around Kapita. The record therefore placed him not only inside a radical religious dispute, but also in a setting where he had experience with organized armed conflict. According to Khartoum police officials, Abbas had once been associated with Ansar al-Sunnah itself. He left after religious disagreements and became associated with Takfir wal-Hijra. The people he came to condemn were therefore not strangers from another religion. They were Muslims from a religious current he had once known from the inside. The Imam of the Jarafa Mosque, Sheikh Bishr Mahai al-Din, told reporters that Abbas sometimes came to the mosque but did not pray with the congregation. Instead, the Imam said, Abbas argued intensely with members and threatened them. According to the Imam's account, Abbas regarded them as unbelievers because he believed they were not serious enough about enforcing Islamic law. Members of Ansar al-Sunnah said the hostility went beyond debate. After the massacre, the movement issued a statement saying Abbas had threatened the mosque's imam and other members and had harassed Ansar al-Sunnah leaders in Omdurman. Worshippers interviewed by Al-Bayan said he had even circulated a written threat warning that he would take revenge if they continued arguing with him. Those claims were not discovered years later. According to Ansar al-Sunnah, the authorities had been told. Police also acknowledged that Abbas had previously been detained. Khartoum Police General Osman Ghaffar said Abbas was held for 4 months in 1998 because of violent threats against members of his former religious group. He was released after saying he had repented. Sudanese Interior Ministry officials similarly confirmed a 4-month detention followed by release after an announced recantation. That history created a very specific situation by late 2000. Abbas had been connected to both sides of an ideological conflict. He had made threats serious enough to lead to detention. He had then been released after claiming to have abandoned the ideas that concerned the authorities. And in the period before December 8th, he was staying in Jarafa with his brother, Ismail, who worked as a bus driver in Omdurman. As police reconstructed the hours before the shooting, they also had a straightforward geographic link. Abbas had been staying in Jarafa with his brother, close to the mosque. Worshippers interviewed by Al-Bayan said he came from one of the nearby houses that evening. But as investigators began sorting through the scene, the number of attackers immediately became disputed. Sudanese television had quoted 2 eyewitnesses, including a policeman named Amin Idris Umar, as saying there had been several attackers. Umar described men in black kaftans and waistcoats. Other witnesses reported gunfire from different directions and believed more than one armed man had been involved. The police account was different. Officials said their investigation and assessment pointed to one attacker. Abbas, they said, had acted alone. That contradiction was not a minor detail. If witnesses were correct, killing Abbas at the scene had ended only part of the attack and other participants had escaped. If police were correct, the differing eyewitness accounts had been created by confusion during rapid automatic gunfire, movement around the mosque, and the arrival of armed police. The authorities did not simply dismiss the question. Al-Bayan reported that the forensic laboratory director said police were preserving the mosque scene for further examination, including the method of attack, the weapons involved, and the number of people responsible. Publicly, however, the official conclusion remained that Abbas was the gunman and appeared to have acted alone. The scene itself could not resolve the number of attackers instantly. Automatic fire inside and around a crowded place can produce sharply different perceptions of direction and number. Investigators could test parts of those accounts by examining the weapons recovered, cartridge cases, bullet paths, apparent firing positions, and any evidence of more than one firearm. Contemporary reporting confirms that the mosque was preserved for that kind of inquiry, although no detailed forensic report was publicly released in the coverage that followed. The casualty count was also changing. 20 worshippers were reported dead at first. By the following day, Al-Bayan said the number had risen to 23 as injured victims died in hospitals. Other contemporary reports gave 21 dead and 55 wounded, while some later accounts settled on at least 22 worshippers killed and more than 30 injured. The safest way to describe the toll is therefore this. At least 20 people were killed in the immediate attack. Additional wounded victims were reported to have died afterward, and reliable sources never produced one completely consistent final number. More than 30 people were wounded. For the families, that statistical disagreement did not change what happened next. The dead were buried in a mass funeral. The wounded were treated in hospitals around Omdurman and Khartoum. Outside Omdurman University Hospital, reports described an angry crowd demanding revenge against Takfir wal-Hijra. The risk at that point was no longer limited to the original shooting. Authorities now had to prevent retaliatory violence, while determining whether Abbas had acted alone and whether the small extremist network around him posed a further threat. That official reconstruction offered a motive, but it is important not to overstate it. Police said Abbas had a long-standing grudge against Ansar al-Sunnah and interpreted the massacre as religiously driven rather than political. The Imam and other worshippers described prior ideological arguments and threats. Those facts strongly establish hostility toward the congregation. What they do not establish is a complete internal explanation for why Abbas chose that particular evening, whether anyone helped him prepare, or whether every element of the attack had been planned in advance. Abbas was dead. There was never a trial in which prosecutors had to prove a detailed theory of his actions beyond a reasonable doubt. Ansar al-Sunnah leaders focused on a different issue: the warnings. Their statement accused the authorities of negligence. They said Abbas had threatened the imam, and members of the Jarafa congregation that security agencies had been notified that Abbas had been detained, and that they were then surprised to see him released. The group argued that the authorities had treated his threats too lightly. That accusation became more difficult to ignore because police themselves confirmed the earlier detention and the reason for it. So the central failure being debated after the massacre was not whether the state had ever known Abbas's name. It was whether officials had reasonably concluded that his claimed repentance reduced the threat he posed. President Omar al-Bashir visited the mosque the day after the shooting and offered condolences to the families. He also announced that Sudan's laws would be changed to give the authorities greater power against what the government called destructive extremist ideas. The response quickly widened beyond Abbas. Within a week, Sudanese reporting said security forces had arrested more than 65 leading or suspected members of Takfir wal-Hijra. Officials expanded security measures, and the government discussed amendments to criminal and national security laws. Those measures were controversial. Opposition figures condemned the massacre, but also warned that the government could use it to increase detention powers and restrict political freedoms. Ansar al-Sunnah, meanwhile, demanded that the authorities reveal the facts of the case and hold accountable anyone whose failures had allowed the threat to continue. The aftermath also exposed a second contradiction in the state's handling of the case. Immediately after the massacre, officials emphasized that Abbas's local Takfir wal-Hijra circle was small and that he appeared to have acted alone. At the same time, security forces launched a much broader sweep against people associated with the movement. Those two positions are not necessarily incompatible. Authorities could believe one man carried out the shooting while still fearing retaliatory violence or additional attacks. But the scale of the arrests shows how seriously the government treated the network after the mosque had already been attacked. A United Nations counterterrorism submission from Sudan the following year listed the Jarafa shooting among incidents the government cited when describing extremist violence in the country. That later official record did not create a new criminal case against Abbas. It reinforced that Sudanese authorities continued to treat the event as an extremist attack after his death. There is no reliable public record showing that Abbas himself ever faced criminal proceedings for the massacre, because he died during the police response on December 8th. Nor is there a clear, accessible record establishing that the 65 people detained afterward were proven to have participated in the shooting. Their arrests should not be treated as evidence that Abbas had accomplices at the mosque. That leaves the multiple attacker question in an unusual position. The police conclusion was that Abbas acted alone. Contemporary witnesses said otherwise. The crime scene was examined specifically with the number of attackers in mind. Yet, the available reporting does not document a later prosecution that tested an accomplice theory in court. No reliable public record establishes the identity of a second shooter. So the strongest conclusion remains narrow. Abbas al-Baqir Abbas was identified by police as the armed man killed after the attack. His prior threats against Ansar al-Sunnah were documented by both police and members of the movement, and officials publicly assessed him as the sole attacker. Claims of additional gunmen remain unresolved witness accounts rather than established findings. More than 25 years later, there is also no evolving legal status to follow in the way there would be with a living defendant. Abbas died at the scene. There was no conviction, acquittal, or appeal concerning him. Later discussions of the massacre have focused instead on violent extremism in Sudan, the history of attacks on Ansar al-Sunnah, and the question of how authorities handled people who claimed to have renounced extremist views. And that brings the story back to the window of the Jarafa Mosque. The gunfire that entered through it on December 8, 2000, killed men who had gathered for Ramadan prayers and wounded many more. In the first hours, even the basic facts were unstable. One attacker or several 20 dead or more, arrested or killed. As the reporting settled, one detail became much clearer than the rest. The man police named as the shooter was not unknown to the community, and he was not unknown to the authorities. He had argued with the congregation. He had threatened members of it. He had been detained because of those threats. He had been released after saying he had abandoned the beliefs that led to his detention. Then he returned to the same religious community armed. The unresolved question is not enough to justify inventing accomplices, a hidden organization, or a motive beyond the evidence. But the established sequence is disturbing on its own. A congregation that had already lived through attacks in the 1990s reported another threat. The man behind that threat was known, and on December 8th, the warning became an attack. The victims are remembered in surviving coverage, mostly as worshippers. Numbers in changing casualty reports, and families gathered around hospitals and funerals. Their individual biographies are largely absent from the record available today. What can be said with certainty is simpler. They went to a mosque for prayer during Ramadan, and many never left it alive. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.